It started as a quiet scandal in the tightly knit Amish community. A married woman, an outsider to their ways, had slowly woven herself into the lives of her Amish neighbors. No one would have guessed that by March of 2012, her affair with an 18-year-old Amish boy would end in a shocking murder that would rock both their worlds. In February 2012, life for Sarah Williams had become a steady routine of isolation and silence. She lived in a rural part of Pennsylvania, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. The small town where she and her husband Tom resided was quiet, mostly farmland, and bordered an Amish community. For over 10 years, Sarah had played the role of a devoted wife to Tom, a truck driver who was often away for work. Their modest house sat on the edge of an expansive Amish farm, a place she admired but never truly felt connected to. Sarah was 35, and she spent her days tending to the garden, attending local church events, and keeping up appearances. Her marriage, however, was slowly unraveling beneath the surface. She and Tom had grown distant over the years. His long absences left her craving companionship, while his return home only highlighted how much they had drifted apart. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when they would talk for hours and dream about the life they would build together. But now, those memories seemed faded, as if they belonged to someone else. With Tom on the road for weeks at a time, Sarah found herself increasingly alone. The house felt empty, the silence almost suffocating. She had no children to care for, no one to fill the void that grew deeper with each passing day. The only company she had was the occasional conversation with neighbors or the local church members. But even that felt hollow, as if no one truly saw her for who she was anymore. The monotony of her life started to wear her down, leaving her longing for an escape. It was around this time that Sarah began noticing Dean, her Amish neighbor's son. He was different from the other young men in the community, quieter and more reserved. He had recently turned 18 in January, a milestone in his life. Yet he still carried the innocent demeanor of someone much younger. He spent his days working on the farm, tending to the animals and the land. His family, like many in the Amish community, kept to themselves, maintaining a simple life free from modern distractions. Dean's world was one of routine and duty. But beneath that surface, there was curiosity, a yearning to understand what lay beyond the borders of his community. Sarah first approached Dean while she was out in her garden, watching him from a distance as he worked in the field. It wasn't long before she struck up a conversation, asking about the farm and his family. At first, their interactions were brief, almost casual. But as time passed, Sarah found herself seeking him out more often. There was something in his innocence that intrigued her. And, for Dean, Sarah represented a glimpse into a world he had always wondered about. Dean, being raised in a strict Amish household, had always followed the rules. He worked diligently, attended church, and upheld the values his family had instilled in him. But like any young man on the verge of adulthood, he began to question the boundaries of his life. The strict routines of his upbringing started to feel suffocating, and Sarah became the person who could show him something different, something forbidden. By mid-February, their brief talks evolved into something more. They met in secret places, away from prying eyes. For Sarah, these meetings became an escape from the suffocating silence of her marriage. For Dean, They were a glimpse into a world he had never dared to imagine. They would spend hours together, talking about life outside the Amish community, the things Sarah had experienced, and the places she had seen. Dean would listen intently, his mind racing with possibilities. It was in these moments that the lines between their worlds began to blur. The more time they spent together, the deeper their connection grew. What started as innocent companionship soon turned into a forbidden affair. Neither of them fully grasped the consequences of their actions, blinded by their own desires. Sarah felt alive for the first time in years, and Dean, though unsure of his feelings, was drawn to her in ways he didn't fully understand. They met in hidden places, always careful to avoid being seen, but they couldn't escape the inevitability of what was to come. One morning, Dean's family began searching for him when he didn't return home. His father found his buggy abandoned near the woods and followed a trail of blood that led to the clearing. By noon, Dean's lifeless body was discovered, lying in a shallow grave hastily covered by branches. At 6 p.m. on March 4th, local police were called to the scene. Investigators found blood splattered nearby and signs of a struggle. Though it was clear that someone had tried to hide the body, the police immediately suspected foul play. On March 3rd, 2012, Tom returned home earlier than expected. He had been on the road for nearly 2 weeks, delivering goods across state lines, and was looking forward to a quiet evening with his wife. But when he arrived at their house that evening, something felt off. The lights were on, but the house was empty. Sarah was nowhere to be found. At first, Tom didn't think much of it. Maybe she had gone to visit a neighbor or run an errand. But as the hours passed and Sarah didn't return, unease began to settle in. By 10 p.m., Tom had called her several times, but there was no answer. His worry grew with each unanswered call. It wasn't like Sarah to disappear without a word. At 11:15 p.m., Tom decided to take matters into his own hands. He grabbed his keys and set out in his truck, driving around the nearby roads, hoping to find some sign of her. As he drove past the fields bordering the Amish settlement, something caught his eye. A horse-drawn buggy was parked near a clearing by the woods, far from where it should have been at that time of night. Tom pulled over, his heart pounding in his chest. He got out of the truck and made his way toward the buggy, unsure of what he would find. As he approached, he saw movement in the distance. 2 figures standing close together. The closer he got, the clearer the scene became. There, in the moonlight, stood Sarah and Dean, locked in an embrace. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Tom couldn't believe what he was seeing. His wife, the woman he had trusted and loved for over a decade, was wrapped in the arms of another man, an Amish boy, no less. Rage boiled inside him as he marched toward them. Sarah pulled away from Dean, her face pale, as she realized they had been caught. The confrontation was inevitable. Tom's anger erupted, his voice filled with fury as he demanded to know what was happening. Dean, though terrified, tried to explain, but his words only fueled Tom's rage further. The situation escalated quickly. What began as shouting turned into a physical altercation. Tom, in a fit of blind fury, reached for a nearby rock and struck Dean in the head. The blow was swift and fatal. Dean collapsed to the ground, blood pouring from the wound. Sarah stood frozen in shock, watching helplessly as the young boy lay dying at her feet. Tom, still breathing heavily from the altercation, stared down at what he had done. The reality of his actions slowly began to sink in, but by then, it was too late. Dean was gone. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Tom and Sarah were left standing in the aftermath, the weight of their choices crushing down on them. It was over, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. By the early morning of March 4th, 2012, the quiet fields surrounding the Amish community remained eerily still. But inside one particular home, a different kind of silence hung heavy: the absence of Dean. His family had expected him to return the night before, but as the hours passed, concern gave way to panic. His father, John, was a man of simple faith, a pillar of the Amish community. He had raised Dean to be obedient, hardworking, and respectful, knowing that his son would follow the values passed down through generations. For Dean to stay out past dark without word was not just unusual, it was unimaginable. John set out early that morning, hoping to find his son tending to his duties on the farm, or perhaps visiting a nearby neighbor. But as the hours ticked by, and there was still no sign of Dean, his father's worry deepened. Dean's absence sent ripples of concern through the family. His mother, Ruth, prayed in the kitchen, her hands shaking as she prepared the morning meal, while his younger siblings quietly went about their chores, too afraid to ask questions. The fear that something had gone terribly wrong was palpable, but no one dared say it out loud. By mid-morning, John knew he had to expand the search. He called upon other men in the community, all of whom dropped their tasks to help. They combed through the fields, walked the paths that Dean usually took, and checked with neighboring farms. But no one had seen him. As the hours dragged on, John's heart began to sink. His son was nowhere to be found. At noon, John decided to search the woods near the edge of their property, a place Dean was known to frequent. He rode his buggy down the narrow dirt path that led into the dense trees, praying for any sign of his son. It wasn't long before he spotted Dean's buggy, abandoned near the clearing. The sight of it stopped him cold, a sinking feeling pooling in his gut. He knew something was terribly wrong. John got down from his buggy and slowly approached the scene. The dirt around the clearing was disturbed, and as he walked closer, he noticed something glistening on the ground, a thin trail of blood. His heart raced as he followed the trail deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what he was about to discover was too much to bear. Then he saw it. A shallow grave, hastily covered with branches and dirt. He froze, staring at the haphazard burial. There was no mistaking what lay beneath. John's worst fear had been realized. By noon, Dean's body was discovered, lifeless and covered in blood. His father knelt beside the grave, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the cold earth. The boy he had raised, the boy who had grown up in this very community, was gone. The grief that washed over him was unbearable, but there was no time for mourning. He knew what had to be done. The police were called at 6 p.m. that evening, and the once peaceful Amish land was soon filled with investigators and officers. The crime scene was a chaotic contrast to the serene surroundings of the Amish settlement. Blood splattered nearby, and the signs of struggle were clear. Someone had tried to cover their tracks, but it was too sloppy to hide what had happened. The police worked methodically, collecting evidence, taking photos, and trying to piece together the events that led to Dean's death. They knew immediately this wasn't an accident. Foul play was obvious, but the question remained: who would do such a thing? The arrival of the police sent terror through the Amish community. This kind of violence was unheard of in their world, a world that valued peace, simplicity, and forgiveness. But now they were faced with a reality they had never imagined. A boy was dead, and someone was responsible. The question on everyone's mind was the same: who? The investigation into Dean's death began swiftly, and by March 6, 2012, the police had begun questioning members of both the Amish and the surrounding townsfolk. The small community was tight-knit, and word of Dean's murder had spread like wildfire. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, and the air was thick with tension. Investigators worked methodically, asking anyone who might have seen or heard something on the night of March 3rd. Sarah Williams, who lived near the Amish property, had not gone unnoticed by her neighbors. In the weeks leading up to Dean's death, several people had noticed her spending time near the farm, often seen talking to the young Amish boy. While their interactions seemed harmless enough, it was enough for the police to take notice. They brought Sarah in for questioning that morning. Sarah sat quietly in the interrogation room, her mind racing. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of the questions that followed. The investigators asked about her relationship with Dean, her whereabouts on the night of March 3rd, and whether she had seen him that evening. Sarah claimed she knew nothing, keeping her answers short and measured. She denied any involvement, stating that she had been home alone when the incident occurred. But the police were already skeptical. Sarah had no solid alibi, and Tom's absence on the road only added to their suspicions. Investigators dug deeper, wondering if there was more to her relationship with Dean than she was letting on. They sensed that she was hiding something, and though they had no concrete evidence linking her to the murder yet, they weren't willing to let her slip away. The weight of Dean's death loomed over Tom and Sarah like a dark cloud. For days, they tried to go about their lives, pretending that nothing had changed, but the guilt was inescapable. Tom had returned home to a life that would never be the same. The image of Dean's lifeless body haunted him. The bloodstains on his hands, a constant reminder of what he had done. On the night of March 8th, 2012, Tom could no longer hold back. The tension between him and Sarah had reached a breaking point. They had been arguing ever since the police started questioning them. Sarah was terrified, urging Tom to stay quiet, to keep their secret hidden. But Tom knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. The guilt was eating away at him, and no amount of denial could erase what had happened. In the dead of night, during another heated argument, Tom finally broke down. He confessed to Sarah that he could no longer keep the secret. He told her everything, the rage he felt that night, the way he had lashed out at Dean, and the moment he realized he had killed the young boy. Sarah was caught between fear and loyalty. She wanted to protect Tom, but she also knew that the walls were closing in on them. No matter how hard they tried to hide the truth, it would eventually find its way to the surface. That same night, Tom made the decision to turn himself in. He couldn't live with a lie any longer. The weight of what he had done was too much to bear. At 10:45 p.m., he drove to the local police station, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. When he arrived, he walked into the station and told the officers that he was ready to confess. In a quiet, dimly lit room, Tom sat across from the investigators and recounted the events of March 3rd. He told them about his confrontation with Dean, the fight, and the moment of blind fury that led to the boy's death. As he spoke, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if the burden he had been carrying for days had finally been lifted. The truth was out, but the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. By the time the confession was complete, the police had what they needed to arrest Tom for the murder of Dean. The truth was out, but the full story had yet to unravel. What had started as a forbidden affair had spiraled into a tragedy that would leave both the Amish community and the surrounding town forever changed. While Tom was arrested, investigators weren't done with Sarah. They found traces of Dean's blood on her clothing and discovered text messages between her and Dean, though the affair had been brief. The messages painted a picture of the illicit relationship, confirming suspicions that she had been romantically involved with the boy. This further implicated her in the murder, even though Tom had already confessed. On March 20th, Sarah was arrested for her involvement in Dean's death. Prosecutors believed she had enticed Dean into the affair and may have even provoked Tom into the violent confrontation. With enough evidence gathered against her, she was charged with conspiracy and accessory to murder. Sarah's trial became a local sensation, drawing in both the Amish community and the town's people. The narrative of a married woman seducing a young, innocent Amish boy and leading to his death sparked heated debates. By June, the trial had begun. Both Tom and Sarah were on trial together, facing severe charges. Tom pled guilty to manslaughter, hoping for leniency. Sarah, on the other hand, claimed innocence, stating she had no idea things would go that far. But the evidence against her was damning. Her relationship with Dean, the secrecy of their meetings, and the events leading up to the night of the murder. The Amish community was left in shock, grappling with the reality of the affair and the violent consequences. The boy they had raised, innocent and faithful, had been pulled into a dark web of lust and deception, leading to his untimely death. As the trial drew to a close, the jury was left to determine the extent of Sarah's involvement. Did she manipulate Dean, leading him to his death, or was she just another victim of circumstances beyond her control? Tom's confession added weight, but Sarah's role remained in question. The story ends with the jury deliberating, leaving readers to speculate. What would their verdict be? Could Sarah escape punishment, or would her secret sins finally catch up to her? In the end, Sarah was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to cover up the crime. The jury believed that while she did not directly cause Dean's death, her actions leading up to the incident, particularly her involvement with him and her failure to prevent the escalating situation, contributed to the tragedy. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 6 years, for her role in concealing the crime and her indirect contribution to the fatal outcome. This case reminds us of the darkness that comes along with infidelity, just like the case of where a wife's secret affair with her brother-in-law ended in murder. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more and more crime stories that will keep you glued to your seats.